Hi guys, we're in the middle of Media Information and Empowerment course, more towards the end of it. This is week 10 and this particular week is dedicated to the unit Environment and Media. Hope you've enjoyed the course so far. This particular unit is divided into two broad categories. First, we're going to discuss about the role of media in environmental communication. This particular lecture would deal with that, while the second perspective is that of the role of individuals and how they can actually be empowered. That will be dealt in the video lecture number 2. Now, upon reading about various issues at large and correlating it with empowerment, you must be wondering why environment. Well, the reason lies in India's vulnerability and responsibility of climate change that needs to be addressed. South Asia is the most vulnerable area to climate change in the world, while India is the 17th most vulnerable country to climate change in the world as per German Watch Climate Index 2018. India is also the 4th highest emitter of carbon dioxide in the world, making it the context of responsibility and vulnerability therefore builds here. Out of 30 most polluted cities in the world, 22 are Indian cities. In 2018 to 19, as many as 2,400 Indians lost their lives to extreme weather conditions such as floods and cyclones. Therefore, it is important to focus on environment in the Indian context. In order to achieve empowerment in its truest form, both individual as well as institutional efforts are needed to combat climate change at global, national and regional levels. Media comes into the picture in this very place. Media acts as a cushioning between the policymakers, the scientific community as well as the public. Now, in order to analyze the role of media in communicating environment and climate, we ought to understand how ideally environment should be communicated. For that very purpose, we will focus on the 6 essentials that Alexander FLOR in 2004 in his book on environmental communication has focused upon. The first essential is knowledge of ecological laws. You must be familiar with ecological laws in order to communicate it better. The second essential is sensitivity to cultural dimension. We must also understand that nature and culture co-evolve, and therefore we must be sensitive to the cultural dimension when we communicate climate. Therefore, you can tap into indigenous or popular media as per the demand in order to communicate environment. The third essential is ability to network effectively. As we very well know, environment advocacy and networking are essential to communicate environmental communication. Therefore, learn advocacy and networking as an art. The fourth essential is efficiency in using media for social agenda setting. Environmental communicator should be aware and adept at setting the environmental agenda by using the media. The fifth essential is appreciation and practice of environmental ethics. For efficient communication, you must be following environmental ethics and you should appreciate the environment and practice the laws. The sixth and the last essential, as forwarded by Alexander FLOR, are conflict resolution, mediation and arbitration. An environmental communicator as a mediator or arbitrator should be able to clarify information and solve conflicts. Next, from the idealistic perspective, we also need to understand the functions of environmental communication and journalism in order to be empowered. The first primary function of the media is of being an information disseminator. Now, media acts as a mouthpiece of the government and scientific community for the public. Media also relays information to the public about regulations and laws regarding the environment. Therefore, media plays a major role in shaping people's perceptions and their awareness. The second function of media is being an agent of change. Media and interpersonal communication together reinforce the message and bring about persuasion to change our attitudes, beliefs and behavior. In order to bring about a lifestyle change for the betterment of the environment, media can act as an enabler of change. The third function of media is being as a stimulator. Media activates latent attitudes, prompting people to take action. Media also helps in mobilizing the masses for collective action by appealing to people's conscience to participate in various environmental conservation and support activities. The fourth function of media is being a facilitator of development. Media coverage, as we very well know, is crucial for any environmental issue to enter into the arena of public discourse and become a part of the political process. Herein, civil society organizations as well as NGOs can cultivate the formation and spread of public opinion on issues of concern with the help of media. The fifth and the last function of media is being a messenger to policymakers. Media works as a bridge by amplifying the popular opinion of people and communities across geographies and shares them with the policymakers and vice versa. Therefore, media plays a significant role in encouraging governments to devise environmental friendly policies. Now we have talked about the functions as well as the essentials to environmental communication. We also need to assess the role of different media platforms and how they communicate environment and ideally should. The first and foremost platform that we are going to talk about is print media, that is newspaper and magazines. Newspapers help in shaping public opinion and influence decision making. Newspapers are also considered a significant platform as they have substantial reach and access, having the potential to impact the destinies of a greater mass. When we talk about magazines, although there are not a lot of magazines in India which specify on environment related information, however, I'd like to specify on this particular magazine called Down to Earth, which is a research centric environment related magazine which highlights a lot of information with regard to environment in the policy domain, in the social domain as well as the science domain. The second medium that we are going to focus on is radio. Radio, as we know, is an affordable, most common medium of information and its signals cover almost the entire nation. Radio therefore enables domestication of environment related information through the possibility of regional level coverage. Now this is an important form of media. Why? Because radio also believes in narrowcasting and highlights information on a local basis. The third form of media that we are going to talk about is community media. Community media includes both television as well as radio. Community media enables remote population to participate and initiate dialogues regarding the regional environmental concerns. Moreover, community media also enables the freedom to deliberate on environmental protection activities for conservation and regeneration of natural ecosystems. The fourth medium is television. Television, as we very well know, because of it being an audio-visual medium, has the greatest retention tendency amongst viewers. Moreover, television also allows primetime slots to be given to environmental programs by the government. Moreover, mainstream channels such as Animal Planet, Discovery broadcast exclusively on endangered species, wildlife and sea life. The last form of media that we are going to talk about in this particular segment is new media. New media is important from the perspective of information, media and empowerment because it specifically talks about us as an individual as well as the society. New media and internet enables environmental awareness amongst people to engage in public dialogue. Moreover, internet's exponential reach and easy accessibility makes it the prime resource for the global population to seek information about climate change, environmentalism and how to be more eco-friendly. Social media sites such as Twitter, Facebook, Instagram are also viable options to share information, thus making it very resourceful for us netizens to be aware and be abreast about climate change as an issue. Now that we have talked about the ideal perspective of how media should play a role in climate communication and environment communication, let's reflect on how practically climate's been communicated by the media. Specifically for this segment, we are differentiating developed and developing countries, wherein developed countries would amalgamate both Anglosphere countries and non-Anglosphere countries, while developing countries would specifically focus on India and other developing countries. The first tangent of difference in climate communication amongst developed and developing countries is scientific certainty. That is, if climate change is a scientific issue to be talked about or not. Media in UK and US emphasize on scientific uncertainty of climate change, whereas in other developed countries it varies on media's representation. They can be scientific certain or they can be scientific uncertain. While in developing countries, India and most developing countries, that is, scientific certainty of climate change has been reflected upon. The second aspect of the difference in climate communication is attribution of responsibility. Developed countries emphasize on us versus them debate, wherein they attribute responsibility of climate change on others. When it comes to media's representation of attribution of responsibility in developing countries, it varies. Sometimes they attribute responsibility to developed nations, while sometimes they attribute responsibility to self. The third tangent of climate communication differentiation is climate skepticism. Developed countries, especially UK and US, emphasize on climate skepticism in their media communication, while other developed countries such as Sweden, Germany, etc. emphasize on no climate skepticism. Same goes for developing countries, wherein the media focuses on no climate skepticism at all, that is, they focus on climate certainty and how it's a scientific being. The fourth aspect of differentiation between developed countries and developing countries on climate communication are the topics related to climate change. While developed countries focus on macro issues such as climate politics, developing countries emphasize on micro issues such as climate change impacts, wherein food and energy security are heavily relied upon. The fifth aspect of the difference between developed countries and developing countries on climate communication is the debate on mitigation versus adaptation. While developed countries and developing countries both focus majorly on climate mitigation, however, there are certain developing countries such as Brazil whose media focuses on climate adaptation as per UNFCCC and IPCC's guidelines. The sixth tangent of the differentiation in climate communication is issue attention versus vulnerability and the relationship between these two. In developed countries as well as developing countries, although they are both highly vulnerable to climate change, yet media in developed countries pay high attention to an issue such as climate change. Therefore, there is a direct relationship between the vulnerability and the issue attention. While in developing countries, although they are also extremely highly vulnerable to climate change, media pays less issue attention on climate change. Therefore, there is an inverse relationship between issue attention and vulnerability to climate change. After talking about the differentiation in climate communication amongst developed and developing countries, let us now move forward and talk about the stakeholders that are being quoted by news reports and by media agencies in the context of environment and climate change communication. The most prominent interest groups who are being quoted or mentioned in news stories can be referred to as claim makers. The first most prominent stakeholder is scientists and scientific organizations. Why? Because they are the most primary source of resource of environment related information in the scientific domain. The second most dominant stakeholder are policymakers or the government. They are also the formulators of laws and regulations around climate and environment, thus are the primary source for governance, hence are being also quoted extensively in media reports. The third stakeholder are NGOs, especially environmental NGOs, who play a significant role in putting forth information in lieu with climate change and its consequences for us to be aware. The fourth dominant stakeholder in climate communication and environment communication are business organizations and corporates. They have a major influence on the media representation of climate change, especially the fossil fuel industry. The context of media ownership patterns also comes into the picture over here. Why? Because media ownership patterns become an important issue to be addressed here, because media owned by fossil fuel industry communicating climate change would be different than a non-media owned fossil fuel industry. The fifth type of stakeholder that we're going to refer here are celebrities. Now, Maxwell, Boykoff and Goodman have highly focused on the celebritization of climate change. They say that celebrities are featured extensively as advocates of climate change, especially in print media. Also, Maxwell, Boykoff and Goodman have focused on 6 types of climate change celebrities: actors, politicians, athletes, that is sports figures, business people, musicians and public intellectuals. The sixth and the last type of stakeholder in this particular context are citizens. While citizens in general are one of the most key stakeholders in climate change debate, however, from the perspective of the media, citizens are often not considered as a key stakeholder and are not usually quoted in media reports. Now bringing the context of stakeholders and climate communication with respect to environment and media, we also need to assess the factors that might influence climate change communication and environment communication, which might also influence media's perspective on it. Now this particular category is divided into two broad categories. One is intrinsic factors, the other is extrinsic factors. At the intrinsic level, journalistic norms are the key factors that affect climate communication, which is further influenced by the editor's preferences. While the first intrinsic factor highlights constraint of time, that is how news is attached to time as a value, the second intrinsic factor highlights lack of knowledge amongst journalists on environment. Especially Indian journalists are lacking knowledge as per the findings of a few academicians. The third intrinsic factor is complexity of climate science. Now climate science is multidimensional in nature. However, as per the media's focus is just on one specific issue, the climate science as a whole is not depicted as it should be, but only one particular issue is highlighted. The fourth intrinsic factor is lack of specialized journalists, especially in developing countries such as India and Brazil. The fifth intrinsic factor is the amount of exposure and placement that is being given to environment related news in both print and television. The sixth intrinsic factor is editorial preferences and publisher pressures, which might affect the overall communication of climate and environment. The seventh intrinsic factor is disbalance in information, wherein if one particular aspect is being highlighted in the media, another issue would definitely be neglected, which would create a disbalance in information. The eighth dimension of intrinsic factors is event driven, which means that media in India and across the globe actually covers only events and neglects on theme based coverage of environment, which might neglect or influence the media representation of climate change. The ninth intrinsic factor is the focus on environment stories, which might have to compete with that on cricket, crime and politics, especially in India, wherein therefore environment as a concept, as an issue takes a backseat and media highly focuses on the first three tangents of news reports. The 10th intrinsic factor is the authority and the stakeholders that are being quoted in news reports, which might influence how media communicates climate change. Moving on to the extrinsic factors, at the extrinsic level, economic, cultural and political factors influence the media framing of climate change at the institutional as well as the regulatory degree. The first extrinsic factor is the economic development of the media organization, as in what is the scale of a media organization, at what level it pursues, if it's a small scale or a medium scale organization. The second extrinsic factor is the media ownership patterns, which might affect the representation of climate change and environment related issues. The third extrinsic factor is the ideology of the media house as a whole. The fourth extrinsic factor reflects on the norm of knowledge production and how knowledge is produced in the particular media house and what are the sources that they are actually attributing to. The fifth extrinsic factor is the access and power of a media house and how it might influence climate communication and environment communication of the particular media house. The sixth extrinsic factor is PR and lobbying, where advocacy and environment communication have a bigger role to play. The seventh extrinsic factor is the political leaning of a media organization, which might also reflect on how a particular media house is communicating climate change. The eighth extrinsic factor is countries' responsibility with regard to international policies and how they are actually communicating climate change at the politics level. Media would also take note of that and would maybe influence the way they communicate climate and environment. The ninth extrinsic factor is carbon dependency of country. For example, for a country like India, which is highly dependent on carbon at the present moment, might reflect on climate change as compared to another country. Therefore, the media would also take note of that. The 10th and the last extrinsic factor is the vulnerability of country to climate change. This comes in tandem with carbon dependency of country as well as the country's responsibility with regard to international policies, and reflect on the bigger political factors that might influence the media production of climate change. Now that we're towards the end of this particular lecture, in a nutshell, we can say that media ideally represents climate change in a more nuanced manner as compared to the practicality of it, which can be nuanced on the basis of developed countries and developing countries. In the next video lecture, we're going to talk about the role of individuals such as you and I, and how we can actually empower ourselves through the information that we're gaining, and the media's role would also build into the picture. Thank you.